wine glass trembled in my hand as I stared at the crimson liquid within, watching it ripple with each nervous tap of my finger against the crystal. Around me, the din of casual conversation and laughter filled Martin's living room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different tonight, wrong somehow. The air felt heavy, charged with an electricity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I hadn't wanted to come to this dinner party in the first place. 20 strangers crammed into a space meant for half that many. All of them here because Martin had promised something special, a performance by some supposedly renowned psychic. As a lifelong skeptic, I'd rolled my eyes when he'd told me, but he'd insisted. Now, watching the woman in question work the room, I felt an inexplicable urge to leave. She was older than I'd expected, with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through whoever she was speaking to. Her name was Helena, and she moved through the crowd with practiced ease, offering vague predictions and insights that could apply to anyone. Classic cold reading techniques. I'd studied enough about con artists and mentalists to recognize the signs. Your mother figure, she's trying to tell you something, Helena said to a young woman near me, her voice carrying just enough theatrical weight to draw attention. She wants you to know she's proud. I took another sip of wine, larger this time, trying to drown out the growing unease in my stomach. The room felt too warm, too close. The voices around me began to blur together, becoming a cacophony of whispers that seemed to press against my skull. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to center myself. That's when everything changed. There's a stronger power here, Helena announced suddenly, her voice cutting through the chatter like a knife. Someone else needs to be acknowledged. My eyes snapped open. The room had fallen silent, the kind of heavy silence that feels like a physical weight. Helena's gaze swept across the gathered faces, but I could have sworn she lingered on me for a fraction too long. My heart began to pound against my ribs. "Look at one another," she commanded. "Really look. See each other clearly. If you feel drawn to someone, if you have a message for them, speak." The silence stretched on, becoming uncomfortable. I found my eyes drawn to a woman across the room, Tammy. I'd heard someone call her earlier, something about her. I couldn't explain it, but looking at her made my chest ache with a sadness that wasn't my own. "Someone here has a gift," Helena pressed, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "a powerful gift that needs to be awakened." Her eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I felt as though she could see straight through to my soul. "Oh my God," she breathed. "It's you." The wine glass slipped from my suddenly numb fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor, but no one moved to clean it up. All eyes were on me, and I could feel their collective gaze like a physical touch, pressing against my skin. "You're an empath," Helena said, moving toward me with an intensity that made me want to step back. "A natural one, the strongest I've ever encountered." She reached for my hand, and the moment her skin touched mine, a jolt of electricity seemed to course through my entire body. The room began to spin, colors blurring and shifting. Music filled my head. Not from any speaker, but from within my own mind. "Don't Stop Believin' by Journey, playing as clearly as if I were wearing headphones. But beneath it, I could hear something else. Whispers, countless whispers, all trying to speak at once. "Tell her," Helena urged, her grip on my hand tightening. "Tell Tammy what you're feeling." I opened my mouth to protest, to laugh it off. But what came out instead was a stream of words I hadn't intended to speak. "Mark," I heard myself say, my voice thick with emotions that weren't my own. "He wants to thank you for being there, for playing your song when things got dark." Tammy's face drained of color. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows in the corners deeper. Someone gasped, but it sounded distant, as though coming from underwater. This was just the beginning. As the night wore on, more secrets would surface, more hidden truths would come to light, and with each revelation, I would feel myself slipping further from the rational, skeptical person I'd always been, into something else entirely. Something that could peer into the darkest corners of people's souls and pull out the things they'd tried so desperately to keep hidden. I didn't know it then, but that night would mark the end of my old life and the beginning of something far more terrifying, because once you open that door, once you let yourself see what lies beneath the surface of everyday reality, there's no closing it again, and some truths are better left buried. The weeks following that fateful dinner party became a blur of sleepless nights and increasingly disturbing encounters. Helena had taken me under her wing, insisting on helping me develop my gift. But with each session, I felt less like I was learning a skill and more like I was losing pieces of myself. The first true horror came during what Helena called a controlled reading. A stranger, a man named James, sat across from me in her dimly lit study. The air was thick with incense, and the only sound was the gentle ticking of an antique clock on the mantel. James had handed me his watch, a simple silver timepiece, worn smooth with age. The moment my fingers closed around the metal, the world shifted. The study dissolved around me, replaced by flashes of images and emotions so intense they made me want to scream. I saw a basement lit by a single bare bulb, heard the sound of a child crying, felt the weight of guilt so heavy it threatened to crush me. "There's a girl," I heard myself saying, my voice strange and distant to my own ears. "In the basement, she's crying for her mother." My hands began to shake violently. You put her there. You're sorry now, but you put her there." James lunged across the space between us, his face contorted with rage and fear. "You're lying," he screamed, but I could see the truth in his eyes, the same truth I'd seen in that horrible vision. Elena had to physically restrain him as he tried to grab me. That night marked a turning point. Word spread quickly in certain circles about what I could do, and soon people began seeking me out. They came with objects, rings, watches, old photographs, each one carrying its own burden of memories and secrets. And with each reading, the visions became more vivid, more horrifying. A woman's wedding ring showed me her husband's slow descent into madness, culminating in a night of violence she'd never reported. A child's teddy bear revealed years of systematic abuse hidden behind closed doors. A man's favorite necktie carried the lingering echo of his last moments before he hanged himself with it. I tried to stop, tried to shut it out, but the visions came anyway, unbidden and unwanted. Walking down the street became an ordeal. Every casual brush against a stranger threatened to pull me into their darkest moments. I began wearing gloves, avoiding touch of any kind, but it wasn't enough. The worst part wasn't the visions themselves, but the way they began to change me. I found myself knowing things I shouldn't know, things no one should know. The weight of other people's secrets pressed down on me, making it harder and harder to remember which thoughts and memories were my own. One night, sitting alone in my apartment, I caught my reflection in the mirror and didn't recognize the person staring back. My eyes had changed. They looked older, haunted, like Helena's eyes. I wondered if this was what happened to all empaths, if we eventually became hollow vessels, filled only with other people's pain. Then came the night that changed everything. A woman arrived at my door well past midnight, clutching a small wooden box. She was desperate, she said, needed to know the truth about her missing sister. Before I could refuse, she thrust the box into my hands. The vision hit me like a physical blow. I saw her sister, saw what had really happened that night 10 years ago, saw who was responsible, but more than that, I saw something watching from the shadows, something that had been there all along, feeding on the darkness in people's hearts. And now it had noticed me noticing it. When I came back to myself, I was on my knees, blood dripping from my nose. The woman was gone, but the box remained. And now I knew the gift wasn't a gift at all. It was a curse, a door that once opened couldn't be closed. And through that door things could pass in both directions. I could feel it now, watching, me waiting, and I knew that soon, very soon, it would do more than just watch. The final confrontation came on a night when the air itself seemed to crackle with malevolent energy. I hadn't slept in days, hadn't dared to close my eyes. The visions were constant now, bleeding into one another, until I could no longer tell, where one person's nightmares ended and another's began. Helena had stopped answering my calls. When I finally broke into her house, I found it empty, not just of people, but of any sign that anyone had ever lived there, except for a single note, written in handwriting I recognized as my own, though I had no memory of writing it. The gift was never meant to be a gift. It was bait. That's when I understood. The dinner party, Helena, the awakening of my abilities, it had all been orchestrated. Not to reveal some hidden talent, but to open a door, to create a bridge between our world and something else. Something that fed on secrets, on pain, on the darkness that lives in human hearts. I drove to Martin's house where it had all began. The place was dark, abandoned looking, but I could feel the wrongness emanating from within like heat from a furnace. Using the spare key he'd given me years ago, I let myself in. The living room was exactly as I remembered it from that first night, down to the arrangement of the furniture. But now I could see what I hadn't been able to see before. The shadows weren't just shadows. They moved, pulsed, reached out with tendrils of darkness toward anything that lived and breathed and held secrets. In the center of the room stood Helena, or what wore Helena's face. Her eyes were completely black now, and her smile was too wide, filled with too many teeth. "Finally," she said, but her voice was layered with other voices echoing as if from a great distance. "You understand now, don't you? Why we chose you?" I did understand. My skepticism, my rational mind, they had made me perfect for their purpose. Because who better to open a door than someone who doesn't believe in doors? The shadows were moving faster now, coalescing into shapes that hurt my eyes to look at. I could feel them trying to reach into my mind, to use the pathways that had been opened when I first began reading people. But I had one last card to play. You see, in all those weeks of touching objects, of reading people's darkest secrets, I hadn't just been receiving information. I'd been gathering it, storing it. Every horror, every tragedy, every moment of pure human darkness, I held them all within me now. And darkness, as it turns out, can be turned against itself. I opened myself completely, letting every terrible vision, every secret, every nightmare I'd absorbed come flooding out at once. The shadows recoiled, writhing as if in pain. Helena's face contorted, the mask of humanity slipping to reveal something ancient and terrible beneath. The house itself seemed to shake, the walls groaning under the pressure of so much concentrated darkness. I could feel myself beginning to fade, my own identity dissolving under the onslaught of so many others' memories. But I held on, kept pushing, until finally, the shadows imploded, collapsing in on themselves with a sound like 1,000 screams being suddenly silenced. Helena, or what had been wearing her face, crumbled to ash. The darkness retreated, leaving behind only ordinary shadows. I awoke in the hospital 3 days later. The official story was that there had been a gas leak at Martin's house, causing mass hallucinations and carbon monoxide poisoning. Several people had died, including Martin and Helena, though interestingly, no bodies were ever found. I still have the ability. I can still read objects, still peer into people's hidden depths. But now I understand what it really is. Not a gift, but a scar. A permanent reminder of how thin the barrier is between our world and others, and how easily darkness can disguise itself as light. I don't do readings anymore. But sometimes, late at night, I catch my reflection in the mirror and see something moving in the shadows behind me. And I wonder, did I really close that door, or did I just convince myself I did? Because that's the thing about being a skeptic. Sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't believing in something that isn't real. It's not believing in something that is. They say childhood memories fade like old photographs, the edges growing soft and colors bleeding into one another until truth becomes indistinguishable from imagination. But some memories remain razor sharp, cutting through the years with a clarity that makes you wish they had blurred instead. Mine dates back to when I was 7, in a small Mexican town, where the night air carried whispers of things that shouldn't exist. I remember everything about that night. The way the moonlight painted silver rectangles on our bedroom floor, the gentle breathing of my sister in the bed beside mine, the persistent tick of the clock that read 1 a.m. Sleep eluded me, as it often did in those days, leaving me to trace patterns in the textured wall beside my bed. The house was settled into its nighttime silence, broken only by the occasional creak of old wood adjusting to the cooling air. That's when I first noticed the change in the air, subtle at first, like the pressure drop before a storm. The darkness around our bedroom door seemed to thicken, gathering itself into a shape that moved with deliberate slowness. I remember thinking how strange it was that I could see the movement so clearly, as if the darkness itself had decided to take form. At first, I thought it was my cousin Maria who lived with us at the time. The figure wore what appeared to be a dress, its edges lost in the shadows, and atop its head sat a distinctive pointed hat that scratched at something primal in my memory, a shape that belonged in storybooks. Not in my bedroom at 1 a.m, but as the figure fully entered the room, the moonlight revealed what my mind struggled to process. This was not Maria. This thing was too short to be her, unless she was somehow walking on her knees. Yet even that rational explanation crumbled as I realized with growing horror that the figure wasn't walking at all. It was floating, its feet never touching our worn wooden floor. The face, God, the face. Even now, decades later, I can see it with perfect clarity. It had the weathered features of an elderly woman, but wrong in ways that defy explanation. The eyes were too large, consuming too much of the face, and held none of the warmth or emotion that makes a face human. They were black pools that reflected nothing, set in a face frozen in an expression of such emptiness that it made my blood run cold. With agonizing slowness, the entity drifted toward my sister's bed. Each inch of movement seemed to stretch time. Like taffy, the air growing thicker with each passing second. I lay there paralyzed by a fear so profound it felt like a physical weight on my chest. My sister slept on, blissfully unaware of the horror hovering over her bed, those impossibly large eyes fixed on her peaceful face. I wanted to scream, to warn her, to do something, anything. But terror had stolen my voice. All I could manage was a small, involuntary sound, barely more than a whisper, but in the deathly silence of that room, it might as well have been a thunderclap. The thing's head snapped toward me with a speed that defied physics, those bottomless eyes locking onto mine. In that moment, time seemed to stop completely. I saw everything with impossible clarity. The way its dress rippled without wind, the sharp angles of its hat cutting through the moonlight, and those eyes, those terrible, endless eyes, boring into mine with an intelligence that felt ancient and alien. What happened next would haunt my dreams for years to come. The creature moved with explosive velocity, transforming from an eerily still presence to a blur of shadow and motion. It shot through our bedroom door as if pulled by an invisible force, leaving behind only the after-image of its form burned into my vision and the violent disturbance of air that made the curtains dance. I dove under my blankets, creating a fortress of fabric between myself and whatever had just visited our room. My heart thundered so loudly I was certain it would wake the whole house. I stayed there trembling until the first rays of dawn began to seep through my protective cocoon. The morning brought with it the familiar comfort of sunlight and the normal sounds of our household stirring to life. My sister went about her morning routine, completely unaware of the horror that had stood watch over her during the night. When I finally found the courage to tell my parents what I'd seen, their reactions were exactly what you'd expect. Gentle dismissals and rational explanations. "You were dreaming, Mijo," my mother said, smoothing my hair with practiced tenderness. "It was probably just shadows from the trees outside," my father offered, though we both knew there were no trees tall enough to reach our second-floor window. A floating witch with enormous eyes and a pointed hat? It sounded like something from a children's story, not reality. Even I began to doubt myself as the years passed, filing the memory away under childhood imagination, despite the visceral terror that resurfaced every time I recalled those eyes. Life went on. I grew older, learned to sleep without a nightlight, and gradually stopped checking the corners of my room for lurking shadows. The incident became a story I rarely told, one that earned skeptical looks and polite nods when I did share it. After all, who would believe in a floating witch that visited children's bedrooms in the middle of the night? But fate wasn't finished with me yet. 4 years after that night, as I sat doing homework in front of the television, the evening news would shatter every rational explanation I'd built to explain away my encounter. The news anchor's voice caught my attention first. Something about a police officer attacked in a town just 3 hours from ours. I looked up, half listening, until the words "floating figure" cut through my consciousness like a knife. The remote clattered from my hand as the officer's description turned my blood to ice. "She came from the sky," the officer's voice trembled as he recounted his experience. "Landed right on top of my patrol car. Dark skin, dressed all in black with a pointed hat." Each word he spoke matched my memory with terrifying precision. But her eyes, they were huge, inhuman. She moved faster than anything I've ever seen. The police sketch appeared on screen, and my world tilted on its axis. There it was, the exact entity that had visited my room 4 years ago, rendered in black and white, but unmistakable. The sharp angles of the hat, the hollow expression, those terrible eyes that had locked onto mine in the darkness of my childhood bedroom. The officer had been attacked while on patrol, the thing trying to drag him through his car window with impossible strength. He'd lost consciousness during the encounter and was found hours later, his uniform shredded and his skin marked with scratches that defied medical explanation. But that wasn't all. As the report continued, they mentioned another sighting from 2010, another police officer, another encounter with the same entity. The description matched perfectly. Superhuman speed, the pointed hat, those distinctive eyes that seemed to swallow light itself. Each detail confirmed what I had seen, validating a memory I'd spent years trying to rationalize away. The remote. Control slipped from my numb fingers, clattering against the floor. My parents, who had dismissed my story years ago, sat in stunned silence as the reporter continued detailing the incidents. My mother crossed herself, murmuring prayers under her breath. My father's face had gone pale, his earlier skepticism replaced by a look of troubled recognition. That night, for the first time since I was 7, I asked to sleep in my parents' room. The darkness of my own bedroom seemed to pulse with memories of that encounter, and every shadow held the potential for those enormous eyes to emerge once again. I was too old for such fears, but the confirmation of my childhood terror had stripped away years of carefully constructed rationality. Sleep didn't come easily for weeks after that. Every night, sound became suspect. Every movement in the corner of my eye, a potential visitation. The knowledge that I hadn't been alone in my experience brought little comfort. Instead, it opened up terrifying questions about what else might be out there, moving through the darkness when we least expect it. To this day, I remain skeptical about most paranormal claims. But I know what I saw that night in my childhood bedroom, and I know that somewhere out there, 2 police officers saw it too. Their encounters made the news, became part of the official record, while countless others might have similar stories they're afraid to share. Sometimes late at night, I find myself thinking about my sister sleeping peacefully while that thing stood over her bed. What were its intentions? Why did it flee when I made that small sound? And most troublingly, was that night really the first time it had visited, or just the first time I managed to stay awake long enough to see it? The years have passed, but the questions remain. In the dark corners of Mexican nights, stories still circulate about La Bruja, the witch who floats through the darkness with her pointed hat and terrible eyes. Most dismiss these tales as folklore or imagination, just as my parents once dismissed my story. But I know better now. There are things in this world that defy explanation, entities that move through the shadows of our reality with their own unknowable purpose. I've seen one with my own eyes, locked gazes with something that shouldn't exist, and somewhere out, there in the vast darkness of night, it's still waiting, watching, floating through other people's nightmares with those impossibly large eyes and that pointed hat, leaving behind nothing but shattered certainties and the lingering question, what else is out there just beyond the edge of what we're willing to believe?